Oman. Officially, the Sultanate of Oman is a country in West Asia. It is located on the southeastern coast of the Arabian Peninsula, and overlooks the mouth of the Persian Gulf. It shares land borders with Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Yemen, while sharing maritime borders with Iran and Pakistan. The capital and largest city is Muscat. Oman has a population of nearly 4.7 million and is the 124th most populous country. The coast faces the Arabian Sea on the southeast, and the Gulf of Oman on the northeast. The Madha and Musandam exclaves are surrounded by United Arab Emirates on their land borders, with the Strait of Hormuz which it shares with Iran and the Gulf of Oman forming Musandam's coastal boundaries. From the 17th century, the Omani Sultanate was an empire, vying with the Portuguese and British empires for influence in the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean. At its peak in the 19th century, Omani influence and control extended across the Strait of Hormuz to Iran and Pakistan, and as far south as Zanzibar. In the 20th century, the Sultanate came under the influence of the United Kingdom. For over 300 years, the relations built between the two empires were based on mutual benefit. The UK recognized Oman's geographical importance as a trading hub that secured British trading lanes in the Persian Gulf and Indian Ocean and protected London's interests in the Indian subcontinent. Oman is an absolute monarchy led by a sultan, with power passed down through the male line. Qaboos bin Said was the sultan from 1970 until his death on January 10, 2020. Qaboos, who died childless, had named his cousin, Haytham bin Tariq, as his successor in a letter, and the ruling family confirmed him as the new Sultan of Oman. Formerly a maritime empire, Oman is the oldest continuously independent state in the Arab world. It is a member of the United Nations, the Arab League, the Gulf Cooperation Council, the Non-Aligned Movement and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. It has oil reserves ranked 22nd globally. In 2010, the ranked Oman as the most improved country in the world in terms of development during the preceding 40 years. A portion of its economy involves tourism and trading fish, dates, and other agricultural produce. The World Bank categorizes Oman as a high-income economy, and as of 2023 Oman ranks as the 48th most peaceful country in the world according to the Global Peace Index. History. At Ibat al-Awal, in the Dhofar Governorate of Oman, a site was discovered in 2011 containing more than 100 surface scatters of stone tools, belonging to a regionally specific African lithic industry, the late Nubian complex, known previously only from the northeast and Horn of Africa. Two optically stimulated luminescence age estimates place the Arabian-Nubian complex at 106,000 years old. This supports the proposition that early human populations moved from Africa into Arabia during the late Pleistocene. In recent years, surveys have uncovered Paleolithic and Neolithic sites on the eastern coast. Main Paleolithic sites include Siwan-Ganaim in the Bahr al-Hikman. Archaeological remains are particularly numerous for the Bronze Age and Nar and Wadi Suk periods. At the archaeological sites of Bad, Al-Jannah, and Al-Ain, wheel-turned pottery, handmade stone vessels, metals industry artifacts, and monumental architecture have been preserved. There is considerable agreement in sources that frankincense was used by traders in 1500 BCE. The land of frankincense, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, dramatically illustrates that the incense constituted testimony to South Arabian civilizations. During the 8th century BCE, it is believed that the Arab, the descendant of Cotton, ruled the entire region of Yemen, including Oman. Waithil bin Himyar bin Abd Shams bin Yashjub bin Yarab bin Cotton later ruled Oman. It is thus believed that the Yoruba were the first settlers in Oman from Yemen. In the 1970s and 1980s, Scholars like John C. Wilkinson believed by virtue of oral history that in the 6th century BCE, the Achaemenids exerted control over the Omani Peninsula, most likely ruling from a coastal center such as Suhar. Central Oman has its own indigenous Samad Late Iron Age cultural assemblage named eponymously from Samad al-Shan. In the northern part of the Oman Peninsula, the recent pre-Islamic period begins in the 3rd century BCE and extends into the 3rd century CE. Whether or not Persians brought southeastern Arabia under their control is a moot point, since the lack of Persian archaeological finds speak against this belief. Armand Pierre Cossin de Perceval suggests that Shamir bin Waithil bin Himyar recognized the authority of Cyrus the Great over Oman in 536 BCE. Sumerian tablets referred to Oman as Magan, and in the Akkadian language Makan, a name which links Oman's ancient copper resources. Arab settlement. Over centuries, tribes from western Arabia settled in Oman, making a living by fishing, farming, herding or stock breeding, and many present-day Omani families trace their ancestral roots to other parts of Arabia. Arab migration to Oman started from northern western and southwestern Arabia, and those who chose to settle had to compete with the indigenous population for the best arable land. When Arab tribes started to migrate to Oman, there were two distinct groups. One group, a segment of the Azd tribe, migrated from Yemen in 120–200 CE following the collapse of Marib Dam, while the other group migrated a few centuries before the birth of Islam from Najd, named Nizari. Other historians believe that the Yoruba from Khatan, which belonged to an older branch, were the first settlers of Oman from Yemen, and then came the Azd. The Azd settlers in Oman are descendants of Nasr bin Azd and were later known as the Al-Azd of Oman. 70 years after the first Azd migration, another branch of Al-Ajdi under Malik bin Fahm, the founder of Kingdom of Tanukides on the west of Euphrates, is believed to have settled in Oman. According to Al-Kalbi, Malik bin Fahm was the first settler of Al-Azd. He is said to have first settled in Kalhat. By this account, Malik, with an armed force of more than 6,000 men and horses, fought against the Martban, who served an ambiguously named Persian king in the Battle of Salat in Oman, and eventually defeated the Persian forces. This account is, however, semi-legendary and seems to condense multiple centuries of migration and conflict, as well as an amalgamation of various traditions from not only the Arab tribes but also the region's original inhabitants. In the 7th century CE, Omanis came in contact with and accepted Islam. The conversion of Omanis to Islam is ascribed to Amr ibn al-Az, who was sent by the Prophet Muhammad during the expedition of Zayd ibn Haritha. Amr was dispatched to meet with Jafar and Abd, the sons of Julanda who ruled Oman. They appear to have readily embraced Islam. Imamate of Oman. Omanis used to travel to Basra for trade, which was a center of Islam, during the Umayyad Empire. Omanis were granted a section of Basra, where they could settle and attend to their needs. Many of the Omanis who settled in Basra became wealthy merchants and, under their leader Muhallab bin Abi Safra, started to expand their influence of power eastwards towards Khorasan. Ibadi Islam originated in Basra through its founder, Abdullah ibn Ibad, around the year 650 CE. The Omanis in Iraq would subsequently adopt this as their predominant faith. Later, Al-Hajjaj, the governor of Iraq, came into conflict with the Ibadis, which forced them back to Oman. Among those who returned was the scholar Jabir bin Zayd. His return and the return of many other scholars greatly enhanced the Ibadi movement in Oman. Al-Hajjaj also made an attempt to subjugate Oman, then ruled by Sulayman and Said. Al-Hajjaj dispatched Mujab bin Shiwa, who was confronted by Said bin Abad. This confrontation devastated Said's army, after which he and his forces retreated to the Jebel Akhdar. Majah and his forces went after Said, successfully flushing them out from hiding in Wadi Mastal. Majah later moved towards the coast, where he confronted Sulayman bin Abad. The battle was won by Sulayman's forces. Al-Hajjaj, however, sent another force under Abdul Rahman bin Sulayman. He eventually won the war, taking over the governance of Oman. The first elective imamate of Oman is believed to have been established shortly after the fall of the Umayyad dynasty in 750–755 CE, when Janab bin Ubaydah al-Ana'i was elected. Other scholars claim that Janab bin Ubaydah served as a wali under the Umayyad dynasty and later ratified the imamate, and that Julanda bin Masud was the first elected imam of Oman, in 751 CE. The first imamate reached its peak power in the 9th century CE. The imamate established a maritime empire whose fleet controlled the Gulf, during the time when trade with the Abbasid dynasty, the Far East, and Africa flourished. The authority of the imams started to decline due to power struggles, the constant interventions of Abbasid, and the rise of the Seljuk Empire. During the 11th and 12th centuries, the Omani coast was in the sphere of influence of the Seljuk Empire. They were expelled in 1154, when the Nabhani dynasty came to power. The Nabhanis ruled as muluk, or kings, while the imams were reduced to largely symbolic significance. The capital of the dynasty was Bala. The Banu Nabhan controlled the trade in frankincense on the overland route via Sahar to the Abrin Oasis, and then north to Bahrain, Baghdad, and Damascus. The mango tree was introduced to Oman during the time of Nabhani dynasty, by El-Fela bin Musin. The Nabhani dynasty started to deteriorate in 1507 when Portuguese colonizers captured the coastal city of Muscat, and gradually extended their control along the coast up to Sahar in the north and down to Sur in the southeast. Other historians argue that the Nabhani dynasty ended earlier in 1435 CE when conflicts between the dynasty and Al-Anais arose, which led to the restoration of the elective imamate. Portuguese era. A decade after Vasco da Gama succeeded in his voyage around the Cape of Good Hope and to India in 1498, the Portuguese arrived in Oman and occupied Muscat for a 143-year period, from 1507 to 1650. In need of an outpost to protect their sea lanes, the Portuguese built up and fortified the city. Remnants of Portuguese architectural style still exist. Later, several more Omani cities were colonized in the early 16th century by the Portuguese, to control the entrances of the Persian Gulf and trade in the region as part of a web of fortresses in the region, from Basra to Hormuz Island. However, in 1552 an Ottoman fleet briefly captured the fort in Muscat, during their fight for control of the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean, but soon departed after destroying the surroundings of the fortress. Later in the 17th century, using its bases in Oman, Portugal engaged in the largest naval battle ever fought in the Persian Gulf. The Portuguese force fought against a combined armada of the Dutch East India Company and English East India Company supported by the Safavid Empire. The result of the battle was a draw, but it resulted in the loss of Portuguese influence in the Gulf. The Ottoman Empire temporarily captured Muscat from the Portuguese again in 1581 and held it until 1588. During the 17th century, the Omanis were reunited by the Yoruba imams. Nasir bin Murshid became the first Yoruba imam in 1624, when he was elected in Rustic. Imam Nasir and his successor succeeded in the 1650s in expelling the Portuguese from their coastal domains in Oman. The Omanis over time established a maritime empire that pursued the Portuguese and expelled them from all their possessions in East Africa, which were then incorporated into the Omani domains. To capture Zanzibar, Saif bin Sultan, the Imam of Oman, pressed down the Swahili coast. A major obstacle to his progress was Fort Jesus, housing the garrison of a Portuguese settlement at Mombasa. After a 2-year siege, the fort fell to Imam Saif bin Sultan in 1698. Saif bin Sultan occupied Bahrain in 1700. The rivalry within the House of Yoruba over power after the death of Imam Sultan in 1718 weakened the dynasty. With the power of the Yoruba dynasty dwindling, Imam Saif bin Sultan II eventually asked for help against his rivals from Nader Shah of Persia. A Persian force arrived in March 1737 to aid Saif. From their base at Julfar, the Persian forces eventually rebelled against the Yoruba in 1743. The Persian Empire then tried to take possession of the coast of Oman until 1747. 18th and 19th centuries. After the Omanis expelled the Persians, Ahmed bin Said al-Busaydi became the elected Imam of Oman in 1749, with Rustic serving as the capital. Since the revival of the Imamate with the Yoruba dynasty, the Omanis continued with the elective system but, provided that the person is deemed qualified, gave preference to a member of the ruling family. Following Imam Ahmed's death in 1783, his son, Said bin Ahmed became the elected Imam. His son, Syed Hamd bin Said, overthrew the representative of his father the Imam in Muscat and obtained the possession of Muscat fortress. Hamd ruled as Syed. Afterwards, Syed Sultan bin Ahmed, the uncle of Syed Hamd, took over power. Syed Said bin Sultan succeeded Sultan bin Ahmed. During the entire 19th century, in addition to Imam Said bin Ahmed who retained the title until he died in 1803, Azan bin Qais was the only elected Imam of Oman. His rule started in 1868. However, the British refused to accept Imam Azan as a ruler, as he was viewed as inimical to their interests. This view played an instrumental role in supporting the deposition of Imam Azan in 1871 by his cousin, Sayyid Turki, a son of the late Sayyid Said bin Sultan, and brother of Sultan Barghash of Zanzibar, who Britain deemed to be more acceptable. Oman's Imam Sultan, defeated ruler of Muscat, was granted sovereignty over Gwadar, an area of modern-day Pakistan. British de facto colonization. The British Empire was keen to dominate Southeast Arabia to stifle the growing power of other European states and to curb the Omani maritime power that grew during the 17th century. The British Empire over time, starting from the late 18th century, began to establish a series of treaties with the sultans with the objective of advancing British political and economic interest in Muscat, while granting the sultans military protection. In 1798, the first treaty between the British East India Company and the Al-Busaydi dynasty was signed by Sayyid Sultan bin Ahmed. The treaty aimed to block commercial competition of the French and the Dutch as well as obtain a concession to build a British factory at Bandar Abbas. A second treaty was signed in 1800, which stipulated that a British representative shall reside at the port of Muscat and manage all external affairs with other states. As the Omani Empire weakened, the British influence over Muscat grew throughout the 19th century. In 1854, a deed of cession of the Omani Kuria Muria Islands to Britain was signed by the Sultan of Muscat and the British government. The British government achieved predominating control over Muscat, which, for the most part, impeded competition from other nations. Between 1862 and 1892, the political residents, Louis Pelly and Edward Ross, played an instrumental role in securing British supremacy over the Persian Gulf and Muscat by a system of indirect governance. By the end of the 19th century, and with the loss of its African dominions and its revenues, British influence increased to the point that the sultans became heavily dependent on British loans and signed declarations to consult the British government on all important matters. The Sultanate thus came de facto under the British sphere. Zanzibar was a valuable property as the main slave market of the Swahili coast as well as being a major producer of cloves, and became an increasingly important part of the Omani Empire, a fact reflected by the decision of the Sayyid Said bin Sultan, to make it the capital of the empire in 1837. In 1856, under British arbitration, Zanzibar and Muscat became two different sultanates. The Hajar Mountains, of which the Jebel Akhdar is a part, separate the country into two distinct regions, the interior, and the coastal area dominated by the capital, Muscat. The British imperial development over Muscat and Oman during the 19th century led to the renewed revival of the cause of the imamate in the interior of Oman, which has appeared in cycles for more than 1,200 years in Oman. The British political agent, who resided in Muscat, owed the alienation of the interior of Oman to the vast influence of the British government over Muscat, which he described as being completely self-interested and without any regard to the social and political conditions of the locals. In 1913, Imam Salim al-Qarasi instigated an anti-Muscat rebellion that lasted until 1920 when the Sultanate established peace with the Imamate by signing the Treaty of Sib. The treaty was brokered by Britain, which had no economic interest in the interior of Oman during that point of time. The treaty granted autonomous rule to the imamate in the interior of Oman and recognized the sovereignty of the coast of Oman, the Sultanate of Muscat. In 1920, Imam Salim al-Qarasi died and Muhammad al-Khalili was elected. On January 10, 1923, an agreement between the Sultanate and the British government was signed in which the Sultanate had to consult with the British political agent residing in Muscat and obtain the approval of the High Government of India to extract oil in the Sultanate. On July 31, 1928, the Red Line Agreement was signed between Anglo-Persian Company, later renamed British Petroleum, Royal Dutch Shell, Compagnie Française de Pétroles, later renamed Total, Near East Development Corporation, later renamed ExxonMobil, and Kalist Gulbenkian to collectively produce oil in the post-Ottoman Empire region, which included the Arabian Peninsula, with each of the four major companies holding 23.75% of the shares while Kalist Gulbenkian held the remaining 5% shares. The agreement stipulated that none of the signatories was allowed to pursue the establishment of oil concessions within the agreed-on area without including all other stakeholders. In 1929, the members of the agreement established Iraq Petroleum Company. On November 13, 1931, Sultan Taimur bin Faisal abdicated. Reign of Sultan Said. Said bin Taimur became the Sultan of Muscat officially on February 10, 1932. The rule of Sultan Said bin Taimur, a very complex character, was backed by the British government, and has been characterized as being feudal, reactionary and isolationist. The British government maintained vast administrative control over the Sultanate as the Defence Secretary and Chief of Intelligence, Chief Advisor to the Sultan, and all ministers except for two were British. In 1937, an agreement between the Sultan and Iraq Petroleum Company, a consortium of oil companies that was 24% British-owned, was signed to grant oil concessions to IPC. After failing to discover oil in the Sultanate, IPC was intensely interested in some promising geological formations near Fahad, an area located within the Imamate. IPC offered financial support to the Sultan to raise an armed force against any potential resistance by the Imamate. In a 1951 treaty covering commerce, oil reserves, and navigation, the United Kingdom recognized the Sultanate of Muscat and Oman as a fully independent state. In 1955, the exclave coastal Makran Strip acceded to Pakistan and was made a district of its Balochistan province, while Gwadar remained in Oman. On September 8, 1958, Pakistan purchased the Gwadar enclave from Oman for US $3 million. Gwadar then became a tahsil in the Makran district. Sultan Said bin Taimur expressed his interest in occupying the imamate right after the death of Imam al-Khalili, thus taking advantage of any potential instability that might occur within the imamate when elections were due, to the British government. The British political agent in Muscat believed that the only method of gaining access to the oil reserves in the interior was by assisting the Sultan in taking over the imamate. In 1946, the British government offered arms and ammunition, auxiliary supplies, and officers to prepare the Sultan to attack the interior of Oman. In May 1954, Imam al-Khalili died and Ghalib al-Anai was elected Imam. Relations between the Sultan Said bin Taimur and Imam Ghalib al-Anai frayed over their dispute about oil concessions. In December 1955, Sultan Said bin Taimur sent troops of the Muscat and Oman Field Force to occupy the main centers in Oman, including Nizwa, the capital of the Imamate of Oman, and Ibri. The Omanis in the interior led by Imam Ghalib al-Anai, the brother of the Imam and the Wali of Rustic, and Sulayman bin Hamyar, who was the Wali of Jebel Akhdar, defended the Imamate in the Jebel Akhdar war against British-backed attacks by the Sultanate. In July 1957, the Sultan's forces were withdrawing, but they were repeatedly ambushed, sustaining heavy casualties. Sultan said, however, with the intervention of British infantry, armoured car detachments from the British Army and RAF aircraft, was able to suppress the rebellion. The Imamate's forces retreated to the inaccessible Jebel Akhdar. Colonel David Smiley, who had been seconded to organize the Sultan's armed forces, managed to isolate the mountain in autumn 1958 and found a route to the plateau from Wadi Bani Karas. On August 4, 1957, the British Foreign Secretary gave the approval to carry out air strikes without prior warning to the locals residing in the interior of Oman. Between July and December 1958, the British RAF made 1,635 raids, dropping 1,094 tons and firing 900 rockets at the interior of Oman targeting insurgents, mountain-top villages, water channels, and crops. On January 27, 1959, the Sultanate's forces occupied the mountain in a surprise operation. Imam Ghalib, his brother Talib and Sulayman managed to escape to Saudi Arabia, where the Imamate's cause was promoted until the 1970s. The exiled partisans of the now abolished Imamate of Oman presented the case of Oman to the Arab League and the United Nations. On December 11, 1963, the UN General Assembly decided to establish an ad hoc committee on Oman to study the question of Oman and report back to the General Assembly. The UN General Assembly adopted the Question of Oman resolution in 1965, 1966, and again in 1967 that called upon the British government to cease all repressive action against the locals, end British control over Oman and reaffirmed the inalienable right of the Omani people to self-determination and independence. In the Dhofar War, which began in 1963, pro-Soviet forces were pitted against government troops. As the rebellion threatened the Sultan's control of Dhofar, Sultan Said bin Taimur was deposed in a bloodless coup in 1970 by his son Qaboos bin Said with British support. Qaboos expanded the Sultan of Oman's armed forces, modernized the state's administration and introduced social reforms. The uprising was finally put down in 1976 with the help of forces from Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Pakistan, and Britain. Modern history. After deposing his father in 1970, Sultan Qaboos opened up the country, removed Muscat, and from the country's name, embarked on economic reforms, and followed a policy of modernization marked by increased spending on health, education, and welfare. Saudi Arabia invested in the development of the Omani education system, sending Saudi teachers on its own expense. Slavery, once a cornerstone of the country's trade and development, was outlawed in 1970. In 1971, Oman joined the United Nations, as did Bahrain, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. In 1981, Oman became a founding member of the Six-Nation Gulf Cooperation Council. Political reforms were eventually introduced. The country adopted its present national flag in 1995, resembling the previous flag but with a thicker stripe. In 1997, a royal decree was issued granting women the right to vote, and stand for election to the Majlis al-Shura, the Consultative Assembly of Oman. 2 women were duly elected to the body. In 2002, voting rights were extended to all citizens over the age of 21, and the first elections to the Consultative Assembly under the new rules were held in 2003. In 2004, the Sultan appointed Oman's first female minister with portfolio, Sheikha Aisha bint Khalfan bin Jamil al-Sayyibiya, to the post of National Authority for Industrial Craftsmanship. Despite these changes, there was little change to the actual political makeup of the government. The Sultan continued to rule by decree. Nearly 100 suspected Islamists were arrested in 2005 and 31 people were convicted of trying to overthrow the government. They were ultimately pardoned in June of the same year. Inspired by the Arab Spring uprisings that were taking place throughout the region, protests occurred in Oman during the early months of 2011. While they did not call for the ousting of the regime, demonstrators demanded political reforms, improved living conditions and the creation of more jobs. They were dispersed by riot police in February 2011. Sultan Qaboos reacted by promising jobs and benefits. In October 2011, elections were held to the Consultative Assembly, to which Sultan Qaboos promised greater powers. The following year, the government began a crackdown on internet criticism. In September 2012, trials began of activists accused of posting abusive and provocative criticism of the government online. 6 were given jail terms. Qaboos, the Arab world's longest-serving ruler, died on January 10, 2020. Leaving no heir on succession, on January 11, 2020 Qaboos was succeeded by his first cousin Haytham bin Tariq. Politics. Oman is a unitary state and an absolute monarchy, in which all legislative, executive and judiciary power ultimately rests in the hands of the hereditary sultan. Consequently, Freedom House has routinely rated the country not free. The Sultan is the head of state and directly controls the foreign affairs and defense portfolios. He has absolute power and issues laws by decree. Oman is an absolute monarchy, with the Sultan's word having the force of law. The judiciary branch is subordinate to the Sultan. According to Oman's constitution, Sharia law is one of the sources of legislation. Sharia court departments within the civil court system are responsible for family law matters, such as divorce and inheritance. While ultimate power is concentrated in the Sultan and Oman does not have an official separation of powers, the late Sultan Qaboos declined to grant the full title Minister of Defense, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Minister of Finance to the ministers exercising those responsibilities, preferring to keep them within the royal domain. The current Sultan Haytham has granted the ministers responsible of those portfolios the full titles, whilst elevating the defense portfolio to that of a deputy prime minister. Since 1970 all legislation has been promulgated through royal decrees, including the 1996 Basic Law. The Sultan appoints the ministers, the judges, and can grant pardons and commute sentences. The Sultan's authority is inviolable and the Sultan expects total subordination to his will. The administration of justice is highly personalized, with limited due process protections, especially in political and security-related cases. The basic statute of the state is supposedly the cornerstone of the Omani legal system, and it operates as a constitution for the country. The basic statute was issued in 1996 and thus far has only been amended twice, in 2011, in response to protests, and in 2021, to create the position of Crown Prince of Oman. Though Oman's legal code theoretically protects civil liberties and personal freedoms, both are regularly ignored by the regime. Women and children face legal discrimination in many areas. Women are excluded from certain state benefits, such as housing loans, and are refused equal rights under the personal status law. Women also experience restrictions on their self-determination in respect to health and reproductive rights. The Omani legislature is the bicameral Council of Oman, consisting of an upper chamber, the Council of State, and a lower chamber, the Consultative Assembly. Political parties are banned, as are any affiliations based on religion. The upper chamber has 71 members, appointed by the Sultan from among prominent Omanis. It has only advisory powers. The 84 members of the Consultative Assembly are elected by universal suffrage to serve 4-year terms. The members are appointed for 3-year terms, which may be renewed once. The last elections were held on October 29, 2023, and the next is due in October 2027. Oman's national anthem, As Salam as Sultani, is dedicated to former Sultan Qaboos. Foreign policy. Since 1970, Oman has pursued a moderate foreign policy, and has expanded its diplomatic relations dramatically. Oman is among the very few Arab countries that have maintained friendly ties with Iran. Yusuf bin Ala'i bin Abdullah is the Sultanate's minister responsible for foreign affairs. Oman allowed the British Royal Navy and Indian Navy access to the port facilities of Al Duqm Port and Dry Dock. Economy. Oman's basic statute of the state expresses in Article 11 that the national economy is based on justice and the principles of a free economy. By regional standards, Oman has a relatively diversified economy, but remains dependent on oil exports. In terms of monetary value, mineral fuels accounted for 82% of total product exports in 2018. Tourism is the fastest growing industry in Oman. Other sources of income, agriculture and industry, are small in comparison and account for less than 1% of the country's exports, but diversification is seen as a priority by the government. Agriculture, often subsistence in its character, produces dates, limes, grains, and vegetables, but with less than 1% of the country under cultivation, Oman is likely to remain a net importer of food. Oman's socio-economic structure is described as being hyper-centralized rentier welfare state. The largest 10% of corporations in Oman are the employers of almost 80% of Omani nationals in the private sector. Half of the private sector jobs are classified as elementary. 1/3 of employed Omanis are in the private sector, while the remaining majority are in the public sector. A hyper-centralized structure produces a monopoly-like economy, which hinders having a healthy competitive environment between businesses. Since a slump in oil prices in 1998, Oman has made active plans to diversify its economy and is placing a greater emphasis on other areas of industry, namely tourism and infrastructure. Oman had a 2020 vision to diversify the economy established in 1995, which targeted a decrease in oil's share to less than 10% of GDP by 2020, but it was rendered obsolete in 2011. Oman then established 2040 vision. A free trade agreement with the United States took effect January 1, 2009, eliminated tariff barriers on all consumer and industrial products, and also provided strong protections for foreign businesses investing in Oman. Tourism, another source of Oman's revenue, is on the rise. Oman's foreign workers send an estimated US 10 billion annually to their home states in Asia and Africa, more than half of them earning a monthly wage of less than US 400. The largest foreign community is from the Indian states of Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Maharashtra, Gujarat, and the Punjab, representing more than half of entire workforce in Oman. Salaries for overseas workers are known to be less than for Omani nationals, though still from 2 to 5 times higher than for the equivalent job in India. In terms of foreign direct investment, total investments in 2017 exceeded US 24 billion. The highest share of FDI went to the oil and gas sector, which represented around US 13 billion, followed by financial intermediation, which represented US 3.7 billion. FDI is dominated by the United Kingdom with an estimated value of US 11.5 billion, followed by the UAE US 2.6 billion, followed by Kuwait US 1 billion. Oman in 2018 had a budget deficit of 32% of total revenue and a government debt to GDP of 47.5%. Oman's military spending to GDP between 2016 and 2018 averaged 10%, while the world's average during the same period was 2.2%. Oman's health spending to GDP between 2015 and 2016 averaged 4.3%, while the world's average during the same period was 10%. Oman's research and development spending between 2016 and 2017 averaged 0.24%, which is significantly lower than the world's average during the same period. Oman's government spending on education to GDP in 2016 was 6.11%, while the world's average was 4.8%. Religion. Even though the Oman government does not keep statistics on religious affiliation, statistics from the US Central Intelligence Agency state that adherents of Islam are in the majority at 85.9%, while 6.4% are Christians, 5.7% Hindus, 0.8% Buddhists, and fewer than 0.1% are Jews. Members of other religious affiliations comprise 1% and the unaffiliated 0.2%. Most Omanis are Muslims. These predominantly follow the Abadi school of Islam, followed by the Twelver school of Shia Islam, and the Shafi'i school of Sunni Islam. Virtually all non-Muslims in Oman are foreign workers. Non-Muslim religious communities include various groups of Jains, Buddhists, Zoroastrians, Sikhs, Hindus, and Christians. Christian communities are centered in the major urban areas of Muscat, Sahar, and Salalah. These include Catholic, Eastern Orthodox and various Protestant congregations, organizing along linguistic and ethnic lines. More than 50 different Christian groups, fellowships, and assemblies are active in the Muscat metropolitan area, formed by migrant workers from Southeast Asia. There are also communities of ethnic Indian Hindus and Christians. There are also a small Sikh community. Languages. Arabic is the official language of Oman. It belongs to the Semitic branch of the Afro-Asiatic family. There are several dialects of Arabic spoken, all part of the Peninsular Arabic family. Zoferi Arabic, also known as Zoferi, is spoken in Salalah and the surrounding coastal regions. Gulf Arabic is spoken in parts bordering the UAE, whereas Omani Arabic, distinct from the Gulf Arabic of Eastern Arabia and Bahrain, is spoken in central Oman, although with recent oil wealth and mobility has spread over other parts of the Sultanate. According to the CIA, besides Arabic, English, Baluchi, Urdu, Tamil, Bengali spoken by Indians and Bangladeshis, Hindi, Malayalam, Tulu and various other Indian languages are the main languages spoken in Oman. English is widely spoken in the business community and is taught at school from an early age. Almost all signs and writings appear in both Arabic and English at tourist sites. Baluchi is the mother tongue of the Baluch people from Baluchistan in western Pakistan, eastern Iran, and southern Afghanistan. It is also used by some descendants of Sindhi sailors. Bengali is widely spoken due to a large Bangladeshi expatriate population. A significant number of residents also speak Urdu, due to the influx of Pakistani migrants during the late 1980s and 1990s. Additionally, Swahili is widely spoken in the country due to the historical relations between Oman and Zanzibar. Today the Murri language is limited in its distribution to the area around Salalah, in Zafar, and westward into the Yemen. But until the 18th or 19th century it was spoken further north, perhaps into central Oman. Baluchi is widely spoken in Oman. Endangered indigenous languages in Oman include Kumsari, Bathari, Harsuzi, Hobiat, Jibali, and Murri. Omani Sign Language is the language of the deaf community. Culture. Outwardly, Oman shares many of the cultural characteristics of its Arab neighbors, particularly those in the Gulf Cooperation Council. Despite these similarities, important factors make Oman unique in the Middle East. These result as much from geography and history as from culture and economics. The relatively recent and artificial nature of the state in Oman makes it difficult to describe a national culture. However, sufficient cultural heterogeneity exists within its national boundaries to make Oman distinct from other Arab states of the Persian Gulf. Oman's cultural diversity is greater than that of its Arab neighbors, given its historical expansion to the Swahili coast and the Indian Ocean. Oman has a long tradition of shipbuilding, as maritime travel played a major role in the Omanis' ability to stay in contact with the civilizations of the ancient world. Sur was one of the most famous shipbuilding cities of the Indian Ocean. An Al-Ganja ship takes one whole year to build. Other types of Omani ship include as Sunbuk and Al-Batan. Omani cuisine. Omani cuisine is diverse and has been influenced by many cultures. Omanis usually eat their main daily meal at midday, while the evening meal is lighter. During Ramadan, dinner is typically served after the Tarawih prayers, sometimes as late as 11 p.m. Arsia, a festival meal served during celebrations, consists of mashed rice and meat, sometimes chicken. Another popular festival meal, shuwa, consists of meat cooked very slowly, sometimes for up to 2 days in an underground clay oven. Fish is often used in main dishes too, and the kingfish is a popular ingredient. Mashuay is a meal consisting of a whole spit-roasted kingfish served with lemon rice. Rukal bread is a thin, round bread eaten at any meal, typically served with Omani honey for breakfast or crumbled over curry for dinner. The Omani halwa is a very popular sweet, consisting of cooked raw sugar with nuts. There are many different flavors, the most popular ones being black halwa and saffron halwa. Halwa is considered a symbol of Omani hospitality, traditionally served with coffee. As is the case with most Arab states of the Persian Gulf, alcohol is only available over the counter to non-Muslims.